They say Tudor mistresses destroyed other women, as if cruelty were their nature. But the truth is far more disturbing. Beneath every whispered scandal lies a world where fear rewrote morality, where silence kept women alive, and where survival demanded sacrifices no one dared confess. These halls remembered the fallen, even when no one else did. Tonight, you will walk beside the women who lived by choices they could never speak aloud. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If kindness ever tried to breathe inside the Tudor court, it rarely survived long enough to leave a mark. The corridors themselves seemed to press against any softness, turning it brittle, shrinking it until it became something dangerous to carry. Women who arrived with good intentions learned quickly that tenderness was a luxury no one could afford. Least of all, the king's mistress. Behind every embroidered sleeve and polished smile lay the same unspoken truth. Survival depended not on purity of heart, but on the ability to withhold it. Mistresses entered the court as symbols of charm, beauty, and effortless appeal. Yet they found themselves navigating a landscape where the smallest misstep could erase them. A single misplaced word, an unguarded expression, even a moment of sympathy for the wrong woman could trigger suspicion. These were not errors forgiven by circumstance. They were violations of an invisible order, one that demanded they remain alert to every shift in mood and every whisper drifting through the palace walls. To fall out of favour was not a gentle descent, it was a sudden removal from the king's attention, followed by silence sharp enough to bruise. The court dressed itself in velvet and ritual, but beneath the surface was a hunger for advantage, so constant that it became the air everyone breathed. Every woman, maid, noble, or mistress, walked with the knowledge that she was replaceable. For the king's favoured companion, this awareness sat closest to the skin. Her position was both enviable and fragile, elevated and endangered. It offered comfort, gifts, and influence, but only for as long as she upheld an impossible balance. She had to please without appearing desperate, charm without appearing manipulative, and obey without appearing dull. And above all, she had to avoid any act that could be mistaken for moral hesitation. Kindness was interpreted as weakness. Compassion was considered a strategic flaw. In a place where women rose and fell by proximity to male power, to feel too deeply was to expose oneself. The walls did not remember affection, they remembered failure. Stories of discarded favourites lingered everywhere. Rooms abruptly emptied, tapestries removed, servants reassigned without explanation. Each disappearance served as a warning wrapped in quietness. No one spoke of what happened, yet everyone understood. A single mistake, an attempt to defend another woman, a gesture of solidarity, could cost everything from influence to safety. Daily life for a mistress became a careful choreography of restraint. She learned to watch without reacting, to listen without agreeing, to smile without revealing her true thoughts. Even the slightest sign of hesitation could be misinterpreted. Courtiers excelled at twisting intentions into threats, and rumours clung to the palace as damp air clung to its stone floors. A kind remark could be recast as insolence. A moment of sympathy could be interpreted as rebellion. The court rewarded cold calculation and punished sincerity in ways that left no wounds on the skin, but carved deep marks on the mind. The women around her were not merely companions or rivals, they were potential architects of her downfall. A misplaced act of goodwill might offer someone else the opportunity to step closer to the throne. The king's mood was unpredictable. The queen's presence was omnipresent, and the servants' gossip travelled with unnerving speed. To protect herself, A mistress had to shrink her world until it contained nothing but necessity. She stopped offering comfort, stopped intervening in conflicts, and stopped asking questions she did not need answered. Every gesture became measured. Every silence became strategic. The cruelty of this transformation was subtle, creeping into habits rather than decisions. The mistress did not wake up one morning deciding to abandon her empathy. It was chipped away over weeks and months of witnessing what happened to those who reached out to help. Women who tried to advocate for others found themselves dismissed, isolated, or quietly punished. Their attempts at righteousness dissolved into cautionary tales, whispered behind gloved hands. The palace corridors seemed to teach the same lesson again and again. Survival demanded a hardness that once would have felt unnatural. Yet what made this environment truly suffocating was the expectation that the mistress remained graceful while enduring it. She could not afford open resentment or fear. Her composure had to remain pristine, even when she felt the ground shifting beneath her. She became an actress performing a role with no rehearsal, dependent on the approval of spectators who could alter the script at any moment. Those who watched her judged every move for signs of weakness, and because weakness was indistinguishable from kindness, both became equally dangerous. There were moments, quiet, private, fleeting, when she might recall who she had been before entering the court. A young woman, capable of warmth, someone who once reached for others without calculation. But in the palace, memory was a liability. To long for softness was to risk losing the sharpness required to stay alive. She learned to let the past recede, not because she wanted to, but because holding on to it felt like standing barefoot on cracked ice. The court was not built to reward goodness. It was built to test endurance. The mistress discovered that the safest path was the narrowest one, bordered on all sides by danger. Her survival depended on reading intentions that were never spoken aloud, anticipating betrayals that had not yet occurred, and avoiding acts of generosity that might expose her to vulnerability. She became skilled at withholding, at stepping back, at allowing misfortune to pass by without reaching toward it. Each day she remained in favor. She confirmed what the court had always meant her to learn. Kindness might nourish the soul, but it could swiftly end a life. Everything described here reveals how staying alive demanded a quiet cruelty disguised as grace, as though the court itself insisted on reshaping every woman who entered it. From this stillness, another layer of tension begins to gather like mist along the palace walls, and somewhere beyond the edge of this fragile safety, a new danger waits in silence, preparing to touch the life of the woman who thinks she has learned enough to endure it. The life of a Tudor mistress rested on foundations so thin that even the slightest shift in the king's mood could make the ground tremble beneath her feet. Nothing she possessed truly belonged to her. Not her chambers, not her privileges, not even the attention that lifted her above other women for a brief, bright moment. Her status existed in the space between desire and dismissal, a narrow corridor where she learned to move quietly, aware that one wrong breath could undo everything. Legal recognition was never granted to her. The law observed her without acknowledging her, as though she were a shadow cast by the king rather than a person with her own shape. In this world, affection was a volatile currency. It rose sharply, fell sharply, and obeyed no predictable rhythm. A mistress lived under the weight of this uncertainty. She could be adored at dawn and ignored by dusk, her fate determined by the slightest irritation. An ill-timed remark, a glance held too long, or some rumour drifting through the palace like smoke. Her security depended entirely on the emotional storms of a powerful man whose whims shaped not only her daily life but her very identity. When he smiled, she existed. When he looked away, she felt herself thinning, becoming transparent, like breath fading on cold glass. To survive in such conditions, a mistress learned to decipher moods with the precision of a physician diagnosing illness. She studied the king's silences more than his words, watching how his jaw tightened or how his gaze shifted when displeasure crept into him. She read danger in the smallest gestures. A cup was set down with too much force. A sentence that ended too abruptly. 9. A footstep that approached without warmth. The palace trained her into vigilance. Not through instruction, but through the constant threat of vanishing. Even at her most favoured. She was never more than one heartbeat away from being replaced. The fear of substitution haunted every corner of her life. Another woman might appear. Softer, younger, more obedient, or simply better positioned within the court's intricate web of alliances. A mistress understood that her appeal was both her weapon and her cage. She performed every day under an unspoken test. Remain desirable. Remain useful. Remain unthreatening. If she failed in any of these, she risked being swept aside with no more ceremony than the extinguishing of a candle. The court would not mourn her. It would merely shift around her absence, adjusting effortlessly as though she had never mattered at all. The Queen's presence only deepened this fragility. Though a mistress occupied a role shaped by intimacy, she possessed none of the protections of a wife. She could be dismissed without reason, without explanation, and without consequence. The court rarely expressed sympathy for her. Instead, it observed her predicament with a cold curiosity, as though watching a dancer balance on a fraying rope. Some whispered predictions about when she would fall. Others waited for the moment, understanding that all such stories ended the same way, an abrupt loss followed by a polite forgetting. Yet the mistress continued, because the alternative, returning to obscurity, felt like another kind of death. Court life offered glimpses of power, even if only reflected through the king's desires. These glimpses could intoxicate, making the precariousness seem tolerable. She accepted the instability because rejecting it meant surrendering every advantage she had fought to gain. She learned to endure the tension of living always half a step from erasure, carrying it like an invisible weight across her shoulders. What made this position truly cruel was its demand for composure. A mistress could not reveal fear. Even when she felt the air tightening around her like cloth wrapped too closely to the skin, she had to present calmness, grace, and confidence, as though her survival did not depend entirely on the emotions of someone else. Her poise became another form of labor, one that consumed her quietly. Even in private, she struggled to relax. The mind that lived each day on the edge of replacement rarely allowed itself rest. The court admired her when she appeared effortless, yet it never acknowledged the work behind that illusion. Every smile, every gesture, every word carried calculation. She could neither cling too tightly nor drift too far. She had to hover in a delicate equilibrium that pleased the king while reassuring the court that she knew her place. In a world where hierarchy shaped every breath, the mistress stood at the most unstable height of all, elevated above many, yet never allowed to forget how easily she could fall below them. And so she lived in perpetual tension, never fully secure and never fully doomed, suspended between danger and desire. Her days unfolded with a mixture of privilege and dread, and even her nights offered little refuge. For a woman without legal standing, existence became an ongoing act of negotiation with forces far more powerful than herself. Each morning, she woke with the same unspoken question: would she still matter by evening? Everything here shows how a mistress survived by standing on ground that shifted beneath her with every breath, as though the court itself delighted in keeping her unsteady. From this unease, another kind of vulnerability begins to gather around her shadow, and somewhere just beyond her reach, a single choice waits to reveal how quickly instability can turn into danger. The Tudor court functioned like a living organism, constantly feeding on rivalry, drawing energy from the silent conflicts that unfolded behind its polished walls. Every woman, no matter her rank or refinement, he understood that she was stepping into an environment where gentleness offered no protection and hesitation could cost her everything. The competition was not declared aloud, It breathed in the spaces between conversations. In the way eyes lingered a moment too long, or slid away too quickly, the struggle for favor wove through daily life with the same inevitability as the rituals of prayer or the turning of seasons. Within this world, the king's attention became the most precious currency, and its scarcity shaped how women treated one another. Favor was not a luxury to be admired, it was a limited resource, a flame too small to warm everyone who gathered around it. As women drew closer to the heat of influence, others were forced into the cold edges of court life, where they learned to watch and wait for a moment when fortune shifted. Every gesture, every rumor, every accidental smile became part of a calculation, because nothing in the court stayed still for long. The presence of multiple women vying for the same proximity to power created an atmosphere that felt both elegant and predatory. They observed each other with the polite detachment expected at royal gatherings. Yet beneath that controlled surface lived a sharper truth. Each woman knew that another could rise above her with alarming speed. The court rewarded appearance, wit, discretion, and timing, but it punished misjudgment without mercy. A mistress might lean too close to the king during a feast, and suddenly whispers would question her intentions. A noblewoman might receive an unexpected gift, and envy would ripple through the chambers like a quiet storm. What made the court particularly cruel was its ability to disguise competition as ceremony. Women stood together during processions, offered each other compliments, and exchanged gifts embroidered with careful phrases. But these displays often masked a deeper tension. Behind the lace and silk existed a perpetual struggle for significance. One woman's gain could only come from the retreat of another. Even alliances formed out of necessity felt brittle, because loyalty rarely survived the arrival of a new threat. A single shift in the king's preferences could rewrite the entire hierarchy in a single day. In this setting, rivalry was not an exception. It was the court's native language. Women learned to interpret subtle signs, who received a longer glance at supper, who was assigned a chamber closer to the royal apartments, who was invited to a private hunt without explanation. These details were small on their own, but together they formed a map of influence, one that changed constantly and often without warning. To navigate this shifting terrain, each woman developed her own strategies. Some relied on charm, others on cunning, and some on the quiet work of observation that revealed what others missed. But beneath the strategies and rivalries existed a stark reality. Every woman was a potential threat. Even those who appeared harmless could inadvertently disrupt another's standing simply by being noticed. In the court, visibility carried risk. Yet invisibility was equally dangerous. A woman who slipped too far from attention could find herself forgotten, her relevance fading until she became no more than a name on a list of attendants. To remain present, she had to balance ambition with restraint, confidence with humility, boldness with caution. The court offered no guide for achieving such a balance. It merely punished those who failed. What made this competition particularly exhausting was the knowledge that it never paused. Meals, ceremonies, hunts, and entertainments, all stages where women's futures were silently negotiated. Even in private moments, the pressure persisted. A mistress might look into her mirror and wonder whether her beauty still held power. A noblewoman might rehearse clever remarks, hoping they would land softly enough to charm, but firmly enough to be remembered. Every woman evaluated herself constantly against those around her, measuring her strengths and her vulnerabilities with a precision sharpened by fear. The relentless demand to outperform others left little room for genuine connection. Friendships formed rarely and dissolved quickly, undone by jealousy or shifting alliances. Women learned to smile at those they distrusted and to thank those they hoped would fail. The court rewarded subtle cruelty performed with elegance, encouraging women to refine their ability to wound without appearing unkind. Even silence became a tactic. capable of shaping reputations through omission rather than accusation. To exist in such a world was to live in a state of permanent readiness. A mistress, especially, felt the tension most acutely. She knew that women around her studied every moment of her presence, searching for signs of fatigue or insecurity. If she faltered, even slightly, another woman would be ready to step forward, to claim the space she left unguarded. The court did not forgive weakness. It simply filled the void it created. And yet, despite the constant strain, the women remained. The possibility of influence, however slight, held them in place. The chance to shape a royal decision or secure a benefit for their families offered just enough reward to justify the risks. They endured the competition because the alternative, irrelevance, felt even more suffocating. In the Tudor court, survival meant accepting that every woman who smiled at you could be sharpening a blade behind her back. Everything here reveals how competition shaped each breath within the Tudor court, turning every woman into both participant and potential casualty. From within that tension, ambition begins to tighten its grip on those who seek even the smallest measure of security. Somewhere in the quiet spaces between their glances, a choice emerges that will force one woman to protect herself at another's expense. Trust held little value inside the Tudor court, not because women lacked the desire for companionship, but because the environment punished anyone who reached for it. A mistress learned early that loyalty was a fragile luxury, one she could not afford to extend without risking her own security. The court taught her, through a series of quiet disappointments and sudden betrayals, that every bond carried a hidden blade. Even a gentle conversation could turn into a vulnerability once someone else realized how it might be used. In a place where survival depended on secrecy, alliances felt less like protection and more like invitations for disaster. The absence of trust was not rooted in cruelty alone. It came from the brutal arithmetic of court life. With the king's favor as the primary measure of worth, every woman existed in a shifting hierarchy, uncertain of her place from one day to the next. A mistress might share a corridor or a meal with another woman, but companionship did little to soften the knowledge that either of them could rise at the other's expense. This awareness eroded goodwill in subtle ways, turning even small interactions into negotiations of caution. Words were measured, gestures calculated, smiles carefully shaped to reveal nothing. What deepened this sense of fragility was the ever-present possibility of replacement. Women knew that closeness to power did not grant permanence. They could invest months earning the king's interest, only to lose it within a single evening to someone newer, someone more intriguing, someone with better political backing. Because of this, mistrust settled between them like dust on old stone, visible only when the light shifted just right, yet impossible to sweep away entirely. Each woman lived with the thought that another might be studying her weaknesses, waiting for a moment when they could serve as stepping stones toward higher favor. Attempts at forming alliances unfolded with inevitable tension. Women who tried to stand together discovered quickly that loyalty competed with ambition, and ambition rarely lost. Even the simplest cooperation, sharing information, offering companionship, expressing sympathy, risked creating obligations no one could safely uphold. A mistress might listen to another's fears, but if repeating those fears whispered a path toward her own survival, the temptation to speak would linger like a stain on the conscience. The court structure rewarded betrayal more reliably than solidarity, and women adapted accordingly. The instability of these alliances became apparent during moments of crisis. When rumors spread, or suspicion grew, women who had once exchanged confidences suddenly avoided each other, each trying to gauge how much of her own vulnerability had escaped into the hands of someone else. The instinct for self-preservation overshadowed any affection they might have shared. Friendship, in its truest sense, required a measure of safety, and safety was a resource the court refused to provide. Without it, bonds withered quickly, sometimes disappearing overnight. Even when women longed for companionship, the court offered them countless reminders of why such hopes were dangerous. A misplaced trust could expose secrets that damaged reputations. An intimate conversation could reach the wrong ears. A gesture of support could be twisted into evidence of conspiracy. These possibilities hung over every interaction, shaping a world where closeness felt threatening and distance felt necessary. As a result, women learned to craft polished facades, approachable enough to seem gracious, guarded enough to prevent intrusion. This emotional isolation did not make women heartless. It made them careful. Many of them understood each other's fears with painful clarity. Yet the knowledge that both could suffer from the other's misstep created an invisible wall between them. They recognized the loneliness in each other's eyes during feasts, ceremonies, and processions, but they could not risk acknowledging it. Sympathy might have offered comfort, yet it also carried the possibility of entanglement, something the court punished with ruthless efficiency. The rare alliances that did form were temporary by design. They lasted only as long as circumstances aligned, only as long as ambition or opportunity did not threaten their foundation. When the balance shifted, as it always did, even the strongest bond could fracture with little warning. One woman's rise almost always demanded another's decline, and this truth shaped every relationship they allowed themselves to build. They drifted in and out of one another's orbits, always aware that closeness was conditional. In time, mistrust became a habit so deeply ingrained that many women forgot when they had last felt a genuine connection. They accepted the solitude because it protected them. It sharpened their perception, kept their vulnerabilities hidden, and allowed them to endure the court's relentless demands. The loneliness was real, but so was the danger of relying on someone else. A mistress learned to carry both with a kind of resignation, as though she had made peace with the idea that some forms of survival required distance rather than unity. Everything described here shows how the court transformed potential allies into quiet opponents, erasing any space where loyalty could take root. From this separation, a colder instinct begins to settle within those who must defend their position alone. A faint tension now stirs beneath the surface of their restraint, hinting at the moment when calculated sacrifice will no longer remain hidden. Survival inside the Tudor court often demanded a kind of stillness that looked harmless from a distance, but carried the weight of calculated intention. A mistress learned early that injustice was not something she could afford to challenge, no matter how sharp or visible it appeared. The court rewarded silence far more than moral conviction. When another woman faltered, whether through misfortune, rumor, or a poorly timed display of emotion, the safest response was to watch without intervening. To reach out was to risk being pulled down as well, and the court had no interest in distinguishing between innocence and association. This habit of standing aside did not arise from cruelty alone. It stemmed from the knowledge that anyone who stumbled created room for someone else to rise. In a world where opportunity appeared in slivers, a mistress learned to recognize when another woman's misstep could serve as her own narrow passage toward security. She observed the fall of others with an uncomfortable mix of dread and relief. Dread, because she understood how easily the same fate could catch her. Relief, because the danger had chosen someone else that day. In the court's logic, survival meant accepting both reactions without question. Sometimes, the silence required was harsher than simple inaction. When whispers began circling around a rival, a mistress might simply allow them to grow, offering no correction even when she knew the truth. She did not have to invent lies. Omission was often enough. Averted eyes, a delayed answer, a cautious shrug. Each gesture subtly encouraged suspicion without appearing to contribute to it. The court thrived on ambiguity, and women learned to exploit it. Standing still, while another woman's reputation weakened, felt like participating in a slow erosion. each day revealing more of the cracks beneath her feet. But there were moments when neutrality was impossible, when stepping aside meant losing ground. In these circumstances, a mistress might allow her presence to push events along. A carefully chosen comment, a detail shared with the right listener, a bit of information framed in just the right tone. These were not daggers, but they cut cleanly enough. The court preferred its wounds inflicted without open violence. Women learned to guide outcomes rather than declare intentions, shaping the downfall of rivals in ways that left no clear culprit. The skill lay in appearing uninvolved, even sympathetic, while quietly adjusting the balance. What made these acts particularly painful was the recognition that the women they undermined were not their enemies by nature. Many were simply trying to navigate the same maze of expectation and danger. They shared the same fears, the same exhaustion from performing grace under pressure, the same knowledge that they were all confined within a system that demanded their quiet complicity. Yet the court left them no room to act otherwise. Helping another woman meant giving her strength that might later threaten your own position. The logic was cold but consistent. To offer support was to risk losing everything. The court's architecture reinforced this cruelty. Narrow hallways, hidden alcoves, and small private chambers created countless pockets where secrets could be traded and reputations adjusted. A mistress moving through these spaces understood that her steps were part of a larger choreography, one in which she could either guide the rhythm or be trampled beneath it. She became skilled at appearing exactly where she needed to be when another woman faltered. Her presence alone enough to suggest that she had known all along what was coming. Even the simple act of remaining silent during someone else's suffering could feel like a decision carved from stone. Women who cried out for help often found none, not because others lacked empathy, but because empathy offered no protection. To acknowledge another's downfall publicly was to tether oneself to it, and the court punished such ties with precision. The safest choice was to remain still, allowing the collapse to unfold without interference. Watching became a form of endurance, as though emotional distance were a shield that kept misfortune at bay. Over time, these behaviors became instinct rather than strategy. A mistress no longer weighed each choice deliberately. She responded to danger with the reflexes the court had taught her. She protected herself by narrowing her field of care, letting the boundaries of her compassion shrink until they covered only what she could not afford to lose. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. What had once been hesitation hardened into resolve. What had once been reluctance became routine. Yet the cost of such survival left its mark. The court admired poise and composure, but it never asked what a woman had given up to maintain them. Behind every triumph lay the shadow of someone else's fall. Behind every moment of security lingered the uneasy knowledge that she might one day be the woman others chose not to save. The cycle turned without mercy, and she adjusted to its rhythm because resisting it offered no hope of escape. Everything described here reveals how survival demanded a quiet willingness to let others fall, as though the court insisted that compassion be traded for safety. From this acceptance, sharper instincts begin to take hold in those who learn to navigate danger without looking back. What rises now beneath the surface hints that withholding mercy is only the first step toward choices far more deliberate. Sacrifice inside the Tudor court rarely announced itself through dramatic gestures or open betrayal. More often, it unfolded in silence, an unbroken line of decisions made quietly, invisibly, with no outward sign of guilt or hesitation. A mistress understood that she did not need to act against another woman to harm her. She merely needed to refrain from interfering. The court provided countless moments where knowledge became a burden, and choosing not to share it became a shield. Danger traveled through whispers, glances, and subtle shifts of mood, and a woman learned to recognize when a warning might jeopardize her own precarious position. When she overheard fragments of an unfolding scheme or sensed the early tremors of someone's downfall, the safest choice was often to remain still. Speaking up risked attracting unwanted attention. positioning her too closely to the conflict. Silence, however, allowed events to move forward without her name attached to them. The court valued discretion more than virtue, rewarding those who knew how to stay invisible while consequences gathered around others. A mistress who wished to survive learned to evaluate whose misfortune could be allowed to run its course, especially when intervening offered no benefit to her. Keeping secrets became another form of self-preservation. There were details she could reveal, details that might soften another woman's fate or disrupt an unfolding plot. But doing so required a generosity. The court punished without hesitation. Each secret she held carried weight, and releasing even one at the wrong moment could expose her to retaliation. By withholding information, she maintained control over her own vulnerability. Secrets formed a protective barrier, keeping others at a distance and preventing them from using her knowledge against her. In this way, discretion became both armor and currency. Sometimes, allowing events to unfold without interference demanded more strength than taking action. Watching another woman's reputation erode, seeing alliances crumble, or recognizing that someone was being maneuvered into danger all tested the mistress's resolve. But intervention was rarely safe. To step into another's conflict was to risk being drawn into its consequences. To offer support was to become entangled in a situation that might later threaten her. The court turned compassion into liability, reshaping instinctive empathy into something restrained and carefully rationed. This passive form of sacrifice felt deceptively gentle. There was no accusation, no confrontation, no evidence of participation. Yet its outcomes could be devastating. A woman who lost her standing because no one spoke on her behalf might never know how many others stayed silent. A rumor allowed to spread unchecked could end a life within the palace walls, without a single blade being drawn. The court excelled at creating circumstances in which harm appeared natural, inevitably, or self-inflicted, concealing the role of those who simply let it happen. For the mistress, the hardest part of this quiet complicity was recognizing how easily she adapted to it. What once might have troubled her conscience became routine, a necessary adjustment to the demands of palace life. She learned to justify her silence, reminding herself that survival required difficult choices. She reminded herself that others would do the same if positions were reversed. Over time, the boundary between self-preservation and indirect cruelty blurred until it seemed almost indistinguishable. The court's architecture encouraged this passivity. Behind its tapestries and carved doorways existed countless hidden spaces where decisions were made without witnesses. Information passed quickly, often reaching the mistress through servants who understood far more about the court's internal machinery than they ever admitted. She listened carefully, gauging which rumors held weight and which were distractions. When she recognized that a particular plot might disadvantage a rival, she stored the knowledge away, allowing the situation to unfold at its own pace. Even the rhythm of daily life supported this form of sacrifice. Meals, audience, hunts, and ceremonies offered opportunities to observe without acting, to allow small fractures to widen in relationships around her. A mistress who remained quiet at the right moment could shift outcomes more effectively than one who attempted open maneuvering. The absence of her voice could be as influential as any spoken word. Her silence, if timed correctly, could become an invisible force, guiding events toward conclusions she did not need to claim responsibility for. Yet she was not immune to the discomfort that sometimes accompanied these choices. There were nights when the weight of what she had not done pressed against her thoughts. She knew that allowing harm could be as consequential as causing it. But in the court, survival relied not on purity, but on endurance. She accepted that withholding help did not make her unique. It made her compatible with the system that surrounded her. Her restraint became part of the court's machinery, an unseen mechanism supporting the rise and fall of those who moved within its reach. Everything described here reveals how inaction became a strategic tool, shaping outcomes with a quiet force that left no trace of intent. From within this restrained cruelty, A deeper transformation begins to settle into the women who navigate the court's shifting threats. A new hardness now edges into their silence, hinting that hesitation is giving way to choices far more deliberate. Coldness inside the Tudor court did not appear suddenly, it formed slowly, like frost gathering along a window pane. Strengthening each time, a woman learned that emotion offered no protection. A mistress discovered early that her feelings had to be managed with the same care she used to arrange her hair or select her jewelry. Every expression, every breath, every flicker of uncertainty could be interpreted as a weakness. The palace watched her constantly, and she learned to adjust her inner life to meet its demands. Restraint transformed into habit, and habit eventually hardened into instinct. The court rewarded composure above all else. Women who displayed too much affection, too much outrage, or too much fear quickly attracted the wrong kind of attention. Emotion made a woman readable, and readability made her vulnerable. The safest path was to cultivate a stillness that revealed nothing. A mistress learned to speak with a measured voice, maintain an even gaze, and keep her posture flawless even when panic tightened her chest. Each controlled gesture reinforced the idea that she belonged in the presence of power, even as she concealed the effort required to maintain that illusion. Compassion became one of the most dangerous emotions she could possess. In the palace, caring for others often required taking risks that no one rewarded and everyone remembered. A sympathetic gesture might be interpreted as alignment with the wrong person. A moment of comfort could entangle her in someone else's downfall. Even acknowledging another woman's fear could place her under scrutiny. The palace evaluated empathy not as a sign of virtue but as a sign of poor judgment. A mistress learned, painfully, that kindness invited consequences she could not control. With time, she began to understand that coldness was not cruelty, it was survival. By withdrawing into herself, she reduced the number of vulnerabilities others could exploit. By keeping her heart guarded, she prevented emotional ties from pulling her into conflicts that could damage her reputation. Coldness became a shield she wore as naturally as her bodice, shaping the way she walked through the corridors and interacted with those who observed her. The court admired this restraint, praising it as dignity, even though it masked a quieter truth. Fear had shaped the woman they now applauded. At gatherings, she felt the necessity of this emotional distance most acutely, surrounded by rivals dressed in silk and guarded by smiles that revealed nothing. She understood that warmth had no place in such a room. Women exchanged pleasantries with tones that carried no sincerity, each studying the other for signs of weakness. The mistress responded in kind, her voice steady, her eyes cool, her gestures elegant but contained. She played the role expected of her, even as she felt the effort of holding herself together beneath the layers of fabric and expectation. Coldness also protected her from the emotional exhaustion that accompanied life within the palace. If she allowed herself to feel fully, fear, hope, envy, sorrow, she risked being overwhelmed. The court demanded endurance, not honesty. By numbing her reactions, she preserved the energy needed to survive another day. Her emotional distance served as a quiet rebellion against the environment that insisted on molding her into something delicate yet unbreakable. She refused to let the court see her fracture, even if she felt the strain deep beneath the surface. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when she remembered what it felt like to be open, to laugh without caution, or speak without calculation. Those memories felt fragile, as though they belonged to someone else entirely. The woman she had once been could not survive in the palace. The woman she had become existed because coldness allowed her to remain. She took no pride in this transformation, yet she accepted its necessity. Without it, she would be swept aside like so many before her, forgotten as quickly as the fading scent of a candle extinguished after dusk. The most painful part of her emotional restraint was not its effect on others but its effect on herself. Gradually, She learned to distrust her own impulses, suppressing her instinct to comfort or intervene. She became wary of moments when warmth tried to resurface. Recognizing that vulnerability often disguised itself as compassion, her internal world grew quieter, sharper, more controlled. She found stability in this stillness, even if it came at the cost of softness she once valued. Those who observed her from a distance saw elegance, poise, and unshakable calm. They did not see the calculation beneath it, nor the exhaustion that sometimes pressed against her ribs like an unwelcome visitor. She had become a woman shaped by the court's demands, a figure of polished restraint who understood that coldness was not merely preferable but essential. The palace had no mercy for those who felt too deeply, and she refused to offer it a target. Everything described here reveals how emotional restraint became the only shield capable of protecting a woman inside the palace, shaping her into someone the court could neither read nor easily destroy. From within this newfound stillness, a sharper vigilance begins to form, guiding her through moments where safety depends entirely on what she refuses to feel. That gathering tension now shifts toward the next test, one that forces her to confront obstacles she can no longer ignore. The presence of the Queen shaped every movement within the Tudor court, even when she stood far from the room. A mistress understood her position in relation to the king's wife with unsettling clarity. She was both elevated and exposed, desired and replaceable, tolerated and watched. The Queen's authority stretched far beyond ceremony. It existed in the way servants bowed to her first, in the way courtiers softened their voices when speaking her name, and in the way the king's attention shifted whenever she entered a chamber. For the mistress, this awareness formed a constant tension, a reminder that she lived within another woman's territory. Yet the Queen's strength could become an opportunity whenever it faltered. Illness, political strain, failed pregnancies, or simply long periods of absence, all created subtle openings in the balance of power. A mistress learned to recognize these moments with the precision of someone who understood that survival depended on reading more than spoken words. She observed when the Queen's influence seemed dimmed, when her allies appeared uncertain, when her presence no longer commanded the same silence. These shifts did not require action from the mistress. They merely invited her to inhabit the newly available space with quiet confidence. Exploiting these moments rarely involved confrontation. The court preferred subtler movements, proximity, timing, and carefully chosen gestures. A mistress might stand slightly closer to the king during a feast, speak to him more freely during a hunt, or be seen passing by his chamber at dusk. None of these acts were overt challenge to the Queen, yet each signaled that the mistress understood how courtly gravity was shifting. The court noticed. Of course, it always did. But as long as the Queen remained silent, others followed her example, allowing the mistress to expand her presence without opposition. What made this dynamic particularly cruel was the unspoken rule that the mistress did not protect the Queen from displacement. To do so would be to jeopardize her own security. When the Queen's vulnerabilities became evident, rumors about failed negotiations, whispered doubts about heirs, and subtle signs of the king's growing impatience, the mistress was expected to remain neutral. Intervention offered no advantage. Her silence, once again, served as a tool. The fewer obstacles between herself and the king, the safer she became. Sympathy, no matter how genuine, risked undoing the fragile stability she had built. Even the Queen's dignity could work against her. Bound by expectations of composure, she often endured humiliation quietly, observing her husband's shifting affections with an elegance that concealed the depth of her vulnerability. A mistress, watching from the edge of the room, recognized that dignity did not protect the Queen from loss. It merely softened the spectacle of it. The court admired the Queen's restraint, but admiration did not prevent it from drifting toward whomever the king favored. In those moments, the mistress learned how power could pass between women without a single word exchanged. As the mistress advanced, she also understood the limitations of her assent. She could displace the queen emotionally but never legally. The court reminded her of this through protocol, bowing first to the queen, addressing her with proper titles, and seating her in places of honor. These reminders served as a warning. Any threat to the queen's formal authority would be met with swift backlash. Therefore, the mistress navigated with careful precision, pushing only where the court allowed. She stepped forward in the king's private world, but remained distant in the public one. Allowing the queen to fall into disadvantage without interference became an essential part of this balancing act. The mistress learned not to defend herself when others criticized her. She allowed rumors to circulate without correction. She avoided offering comfort, even when silence felt heavy between them. None of these choices required malice. They required discipline. The court expected the mistress to understand that her survival depended on the queen's diminishing influence. Even if the queen herself had never acted against her personally, the unspoken competition between them rarely erupted into open conflict. Instead, it unfolded in the subtle choreography of who stood closest to the king, who received messages first, who was summoned unexpectedly, who shared private moments the queen could not interrupt. Every shift in placement told a story that the court read attentively. The mistress understood that even the smallest display of increased intimacy served as a signal, one that slowly pushed the queen further into the shadows. There were times when the mistress felt the weight of this displacement more keenly than she wished to admit. Watching a woman of high birth lose ground with grace could stir something uncomfortable inside her, but allowing those emotions to surface was too dangerous. The court demanded that she accept the consequences of her assent with quiet resolve. She hardened herself not because she lacked empathy, but because empathy threatened the fragile structure she depended on. Coldness became the boundary between survival and ruin. By refusing to intervene in the queen's gradual isolation, the mistress confirmed her understanding of the court's unspoken laws. She did not challenge them. She learned to navigate them with a precision that grew sharper each day. And in doing so, she became part of the system that shaped the fate of every woman who stepped too close to the king's favor. Everything described here reveals how the queen's decline became the mistress's unspoken advantage. A shift she recognized, yet could not openly acknowledge. From within this quiet recalibration of power, a deeper ruthlessness begins to settle into her choices. Rising ahead is a moment where displacement no longer happens through absence alone, but through intention sharpened by necessity. The Tudor court existed in a state of constant rearrangement, a living structure that shifted with every whim, rumor, and disappointment. A mistress understood that her position, no matter how secure it felt, was only ever temporary. The rise of one woman required the quiet displacement of another, and this cycle moved with such regularity that it became part of the court's rhythm. No one stayed at the center for long. Even those favored intensely could find themselves pushed aside with startling speed, their relevance evaporating between one evening and the next. Every woman who stood in the glow of influence carried the shadow of those who had stood there before her. She could walk into a chamber where tapestries glowed with candlelight and still feel the faint impression of another woman's presence lingering in the air. The court remembered its fallen not through sympathy but through cautionary stories, names spoken softly, events recalled vaguely, the scent of their decline clinging to the edges of conversation. These reminders were not meant to evoke pity. They served as warnings that the court's embrace was never meant to last. Power changed hands constantly, sometimes without explanation. The king's interest might shift because of political pressure, personal boredom, or a single misinterpreted moment. A mistress learned to sense when the air had turned against someone else. A shorter glance, a colder tone, an absence too long to ignore. Yet, even as she recognized the signs in others, she lived with the knowledge that these same signs could one day attach themselves to her. The unpredictability forced her to move with precision, never certain which gesture would maintain her standing and which would undo it. Hesitation became one of the greatest dangers she faced. In a court where opportunities were rare and fleeting, pausing too long could mean losing ground permanently. A mistress might hesitate to assert herself, fearing the consequences of boldness, only to discover that her reluctance made her appear weak. She might hesitate to take advantage of a rival's misfortune, only to learn that another woman had already stepped forward to fill the space. The court punished those who moved too quickly and those who moved too slowly. The only safe path lay in sensing the exact moment when action became unavoidable. Every decision she made carried the weight of this uncertainty. She learned to evaluate risks with an instinct sharpened by constant surveillance, watching for subtle shifts in expression, listening for strains in the king's voice, observing the movement of courtiers from across the room. She recognized how quickly fortune turned and how ruthless the court became when someone's relevance began to fade. Once the tide shifted against a woman, few cared enough to oppose it. The court let her fall, its attention already drifting toward the next figure destined for favor. This relentless instability shaped not only her choices, but her identity. She became someone who anticipated loss, who prepared for sudden changes in mood or circumstance, who accepted that affection could vanish without explanation. Even in moments of triumph, she felt the presence of uncertainty, a quiet pressure that reminded her not to trust the ease of the present. The court offered luxury and danger in equal measure, and she navigated both with a mixture of caution and ambition. What made this environment truly suffocating was the understanding that no woman was ever removed because she deserved it. Removal was simply the natural outcome of attention shifting elsewhere. A new face, a new alliance, a new political convenience. Any of these could redefine her place within a single evening. She might walk into a feast believing herself secure and leave it understanding that her time was already ending. The court rarely delivered clear warnings. It preferred the cruelty of gradual exclusion, a slow unraveling that forced her to recognize her decline long before anyone acknowledged it aloud. To protect herself, she learned to move before circumstances demanded it. She stepped into spaces others had not yet noticed, aligned herself with allies before they became valuable, and distanced herself from individuals whose downfall seemed imminent. Each of these choices required precision and emotional restraint, shaped by the knowledge that survival depended on staying one breath ahead of danger. She cultivated an instinct for recognizing when proximity to another woman put her at risk, and she retreated, even when doing so felt quietly brutal. Yet despite her vigilance, she could not escape the truth that lingered in every corridor. Today's victor could become tomorrow's casualty. The court did not grant immunity. It merely delayed the inevitable. A mistress lived with this tension, always pressing against her spine. A reminder that her success came with an expiration date written in ink she could not see. Everything described here reveals how the court's shifting loyalties turned survival into a race without a finish, forcing each woman to anticipate danger long before it reached her. From within this relentless uncertainty, an even sharper instinct begins to take hold, urging her to act before opportunity slips away. Rising ahead is a moment when hesitation becomes indistinguishable from defeat, demanding choices she can no longer postpone. Control inside the Tudor court rarely relied on open force. It was shaped instead by the careful movement of words. What was spoken, what was withheld, and what was rearranged just enough to shift someone's fate. A mistress understood that information itself carried power, often more effectively than beauty, charm, or influence. Conversations behind half-closed doors, passing comments during a walk, whispers exchanged in private chambers. All of these became tools she learned to wield with precision. Within the palace, truth did not need to be erased, it only needed to be redirected. Choosing what to tell the king required an instinct sharpened by constant observation. She understood that he could not absorb every detail of court life, nor did he wish to. He relied on others to shape the world he thought he ruled directly. A mistress discovered that offering him selective truths allowed her to guide his perceptions without appearing to manipulate them. She decided which moments to highlight, which concerns to emphasize, and which harmless gestures to present as meaningful. This method did not demand lies, it demanded emphasis. And in the court, emphasis held more influence than fact. There were occasions when softening or distorting information became necessary. A simple adjustment in tone, a pause before speaking, a slight suggestion that something seemed unusual. These subtle techniques could reshape an entire narrative. When used skillfully, they cast doubt on those she wished to distance herself from and fostered trust in those she needed to protect. The king, accustomed to being surrounded by opinions disguised as loyalty, rarely recognized how carefully her words had been crafted. His decisions, though seemingly his own, often carried her fingerprints. Manipulation did not always require speech. Silence was just as effective, especially in moments when truth would have endangered her. By omitting key details, she allowed certain events to unfold unchecked, guiding outcomes without drawing attention to her involvement. Silence protected her from accusations, because no one could claim she had spoken falsely. What she withheld became as consequential as what she shared. The court admired those who appeared discreet, but it did not understand how much strategy hid behind that quietness. Within the private rooms of the palace, where discussions seemed harmless and confidential, she shaped the king's understanding most effectively. These spaces granted her access that no other woman possessed. She spoke softly, offering half-formed reflections that appeared humble, yet subtly guided his thinking. She learned that certainty could provoke suspicion, but thoughtful hesitation invited curiosity. By framing her comments as concerns rather than conclusions, she encouraged him to reach interpretations she had already prepared for him. The intimacy of the setting gave her influence that no advisor could match. Yet manipulation required balance. If she pushed too hard, she risked exposing her intentions. If she spoke too little, she risked losing relevance. She walked this line with the care of someone navigating a ledge in darkness, knowing that even one misjudged word could unravel months of careful positioning. The king valued her presence because she appeared trustworthy, and she understood that this trust was her most fragile asset. Maintaining it meant blending sincerity with calculation, until even she could no longer distinguish one from the other. While she influenced the king, others attempted to influence her. Servants delivered information couched in suggestion. Courtiers hinted at alliances, and rivals tried to plant doubts in her mind. Each piece of information arrived layered with intention, and she learned to sift through it with caution. Accepting a rumor too quickly could entangle her in someone else's ambitions. Dismissing it too slowly could allow danger to creep closer unnoticed. Her survival depended on discerning both motives and truth, buried beneath countless manipulations. Over time, she realized that the court operated like a maze of shifting thoughts, not walls. Each person contributed to the movement of meaning, twisting events into stories that suited their agenda. She adapted by becoming fluent in ambiguity. Direct questions were rare, direct answers were rarer still. She mastered the art of speaking in ways that allowed listeners to draw their own conclusions. Conclusions she had quietly steered into place. This indirectness protected her from retaliation while amplifying her reach. The consequences of this manipulation extended far beyond simple misunderstandings. A single, carefully shaped conversation could alter alliances, end a rivalry, or quietly destroy a woman's standing. She did not need to witness the fallout to feel its echo. The court adjusted itself after each shift, and she watched as those who failed to manage their own narratives slipped into irrelevance. She learned, again and again, that perception ruled the palace far more than truth. And in this environment, shaping perception became her most essential skill. It allowed her to remain visible without being exposed, influential without being accused. Through her quiet manipulation of words, she carved out a space of safety in a world intent on erasing those who hesitated. She understood the danger of her role, but she also understood its necessity. The court demanded strategies that left no evidence behind, and she provided them with expertise refined by fear. Everything described here reveals how shaping the king's understanding became the mistress's most effective form of defense, allowing her to guide danger away without ever appearing involved. From within this delicate weaving of truth and omission, a deeper cunning begins to guide her movements as threats close in on all sides. Emerging next is a moment when information alone is not enough, and survival demands a choice far colder than words. Pregnancy inside the Tudor court carried a weight far greater than the life it promised. When another mistress began to show signs of expectancy, the atmosphere shifted in an instant, as though the palace itself tightened around the possibility of change. A child, especially a son, could rearrange every fragile hierarchy that women had spent years navigating. The mistress who had once felt secure in her position now found herself confronting a threat she could neither confront openly nor ignore. The space around her filled with a quiet dread, each passing day deepening the uncertainty pressing against her ribs. A pregnancy transformed rivalry into something far sharper. The presence of a potential heir elevated the expectant mother in ways that no charm or influence could match. She acquired a new kind of power, one rooted not in favor, but in biological possibility. Courtiers shifted toward her subtly, adjusting their alliances in anticipation of what the future might require. Servants paid closer attention to her needs. Even the king's demeanor changed, his gestures softening or sharpening depending on whether hope or anxiety guided him. The pregnant woman became a center of gravity, and everyone else felt themselves pulled or repelled by her condition. For the mistress, watching this unfold, the danger was unmistakable. A child could erase her relevance overnight, reducing her to a footnote in a story she had once believed she controlled. Her charm, her influence, her hard-won proximity to the king, all of it could become insignificant if another woman delivered something she never could. The fear did not announce itself loudly. It crept through her thoughts in quiet moments, reminding her that the court valued potential heirs more than affection. Beauty faded quickly. Children altered destinies. Silence became both refuge and weapon in such times. A mistress who learned of the pregnancy early often felt the instinct to speak, to warn someone, to question the circumstance, to express concern. Yet every possible reaction carried risk. If she spoke too soon, she appeared jealous. If she pretended indifference, she seemed deceptive. If she attempted to sabotage the woman, even indirectly, the punishment could be swift and brutal if discovered. And so silence settled around her like a heavy cloak. She watched events unfold, knowing that withholding knowledge might protect her, even as it allowed danger to grow uninterrupted. The Queen's reaction to the pregnancy added another layer of complexity. A child conceived outside marriage threatened her position as well. Yet she was bound by tradition, dignity, and expectation. She could show displeasure, but only in controlled, restrained ways. The mistress observing this tension understood that the Queen's limited power made the situation even more volatile. When the Queen suffered, the court looked to her with pity or contempt, and these shifting sentiments influenced how others viewed the pregnant woman. The mistress navigated these currents carefully, aware that aligning herself incorrectly could expose her to ruin. The expectant mother rarely enjoyed her newfound influence without fear. Pregnancy was dangerous in its own right, and within the court, every symptom carried political weight. A fainting spell could spark rumors. A difficult month could invite speculation. A miscarriage could erase her importance, leaving her more vulnerable than before. The mistress watching her understood this and sometimes felt a complicated mixture of relief and guilt. Misfortune, when it happened to others, often preserved her own position. The court had trained her to accept such outcomes without visible reaction. But when the pregnancy progressed successfully, Tension escalated. Gifts arrived. Advisors whispered. The king's attention grew more focused on the unborn child. The mistress felt her own future narrowing, her influence shrinking as the months passed, even if the child did not survive. The memory of its possibility lingered, reshaping her standing within the palace. Every step the expectant woman took seemed to echo louder, as though the court listened not to her footsteps, but to the promise developing inside her. The mistress learned to measure her actions with extraordinary caution. Even the smallest comment could be misinterpreted as hostility toward the unborn child. She avoided the pregnant woman, avoided conversations about her condition, and avoided rooms where discussions about heirs or succession unfolded. But avoidance did not free her from danger. It only delayed confrontation with the reality that her future rested in the hands of someone else's womb. She experienced a rare kind of powerlessness, one that no manipulation or charm could counter. In the darkest moments, she felt the court watching her more closely than it watched the pregnant woman. They searched for bitterness in her posture, for jealousy in her silence, for strategies in her stillness. She became aware that even her restraint could be used against her, interpreted, judged, and reshaped into narratives she had no control over. She stood in a delicate space where every breath seemed to betray something. As the pregnancy advanced, she found herself wondering who she would become if the child survived. Would she be merely tolerated, quietly ignored, pushed into a distant chamber to make room for new priorities? The uncertainty gnawed at her with a persistence she could not soothe. She recognized that her fear was not only for her position, but for her identity. The court had shaped her into someone who relied entirely on the king's attention. Without it, she would become invisible, and yet she maintained her composure. Because the court demanded it. She did not crumble. She did not plead. She did not reveal the turmoil twisting inside her. Instead, she stood with elegant stillness, while a rival's pregnancy rewrote the world around her. Everything described here reveals how a single pregnancy could destabilize the delicate balance of power, turning rivalry into a fight for survival and silence into an unspoken sentence. From within this tightening pressure, a harsher instinct begins to rise in those who stand to lose everything. Approaching now is a moment when survival demands accepting what must fall for her place to remain intact. Servant women lived in the court's narrowest margins, occupying a space so fragile that even their presence felt temporary. They moved quietly through corridors, carrying linens, tending fires, delivering messages, always aware that their roles could vanish without ceremony. A mistress understood this vulnerability better than anyone. She watched how servants blended into the background, how their labor filled every room, yet their existence remained barely acknowledged. In a world where influence determined survival, these women possessed nothing that could protect them. Their replaceability made them the court's most convenient offerings when misfortune needed an explanation. A misplaced letter, a delayed message, a seemingly minor breach of protocol. Any of these could be reshaped into a servant's failure. When tension rose within the palace, eyes turned toward them with unforgiving ease. It was simpler to blame someone who had no allies, no power, and no voice loud enough to defend herself. The court relied on this simplicity. It allowed the powerful to preserve their reputations by assigning fault to those with no ability to resist. A mistress observed this pattern and learned to use it when necessary. She rarely acted out of malice. Instead, she acted out of a sharpened understanding of how the court operated. When danger drifted too close, when suspicion threatened her position, directing attention toward a servant could disperse the threat without exposing her intentions. A dropped hint, a slight suggestion of incompetence, an expression of disappointment. These were enough to steer scrutiny away from her. She did not need to accuse directly. The court completed the accusation for her. Silence also played a role in these sacrifices. A mistress might witness a moment that could harm a woman of higher status. Yet saying nothing allowed blame to settle naturally onto the nearest servant. She understood that intervening would achieve nothing except placing herself in unnecessary danger. The court had no interest in protecting those who worked silently in its shadow, even if she wished to help them. Doing so openly would be interpreted as weakness or recklessness. Restraint became the only rational choice, even when it felt quietly merciless. These women, who scrubbed stones until their hands burned raw and carried trays until their arms trembled, endured their vulnerability with a mixture of resignation and fear. They knew that their safety depended not on their effort, but on the moods of those above them. A single frown from a mistress, a half-heard whisper from a noblewoman, or a glance from the queen could determine whether they kept their position or lost it before sunset. Their daily labor was not only physical but emotional. Constant vigilance against mistakes they might never be aware of making. A mistress understood their fear and sometimes shared it, though she occupied a higher rung. The instability connecting every woman in the court tied their fates together more closely than anyone admitted. She recognized that the treatment of servants revealed how the court handled vulnerability, swiftly, ruthlessly, without hesitation. Their sacrifices demonstrated the logic of survival inside the palace. Those with the least protection absorbed the most blame. Their suffering created a buffer that shielded women of higher status, including mistresses. In this sense, the servants became quiet participants in struggles they never chose. Yet the mistress's reliance on them did not soften the court's cruelty. When a scandal erupted, when secrets threatened to surface, when the king demanded accountability, it was often a servant who paid the price. They disappeared from corridors overnight, dismissed for reasons only vaguely explained. Some were rumoured to have fallen ill. Others were said to have retired. Many were simply replaced, their absence acknowledged only through the appearance of another girl wearing the same uniform, performing the same tasks, hoping not to draw the same kind of attention. On rare occasions, a mistress felt a pang of guilt for the role she played in this cycle. She recalled moments when a servant's trembling hands had tied her laces, or when a girl barely older than childhood had carried her messages with quiet loyalty. Yet guilt served no purpose in the court's ecosystem. It changed nothing. Expressing regret would only expose her to ridicule or suspicion, so she allowed the feeling to dissolve into the cold discipline the palace required, convincing herself that she, too, was only doing what survival demanded. The tragedy was that no one of influence intervened on behalf of these women. The queen did not protect them. Courtiers ignored them. The king rarely noticed them unless something had gone wrong. Their disposability was an unspoken rule, upheld by everyone who benefited from it. A mistress learned that even those who seemed safe for the moment were always one misstep away from becoming another forgotten figure. The palace functioned by consuming the most vulnerable first. Over time, she grew accustomed to these disappearances. Missing faces no longer surprised her. Empty spaces in the servant quarters felt ordinary. The court taught her not to ask questions, because questions implied attachment, and attachment implied weakness. She accepted the sacrifices of servant women as yet another inevitable feature of palace life. A truth no one acknowledged aloud. Yet everyone relied upon to maintain their own stability. In the silence, left behind by each vanished servant, the mistress heard a warning meant for her as well. The hierarchy merely delayed certain consequences. It did not eliminate them. She understood that one day, the court might demand a sacrifice from her, too, and someone else would remain quiet to preserve their place. Everything described here reveals how the court absorbed its weakest women without hesitation, turning their lives into shields for those who needed protection most. From within this cruel logic, a colder understanding settles into the mistress who witnesses it. Rising ahead is a moment when disappearance becomes not tragedy, but strategy, used to secure one woman's fragile position. Disappearance inside the Tudor court rarely arrived with noise. It began quietly. First as an absence at a meal, then an empty chair in a chamber, then a missing pair of footsteps in the morning corridors. Women slipped out of the palace's structure with unsettling ease. erased, not by scandal or ceremony, but by silence. A mistress understood that the court preferred its losses this way, unrecorded, unexplained, and untraceable. The palace was a place that demanded constant movement, and those who vanished became nothing more than faint impressions on stone floors that were soon covered by the footsteps of others. No official record marked their departures. Scribes wrote endlessly about treaties, marriages, battles, and the king's shifting political moods. Yet they rarely wrote about the women who served or rivaled, or simply existed within the palace's margins. These women dissolved into the background of history, as though their lives were temporary shadows cast by candlelight. There, one evening, gone the next, without expectation of remembrance. A mistress recognized the cruelty of this erasure, though she also relied on its convenience. It allowed the court to maintain its polished surface while swallowing its casualties whole. Even the reasons for their disappearance remained elusive. Courtiers invented explanations that required no evidence: illness, marriage, dismissal, or divine calling. These vague stories drifted through corridors, repeated with a disinterested ease that suggested no one truly cared whether they were true. The mistress listened to these rumours and understood their purpose. Ambiguity protected the court from scrutiny. The fewer people who knew, the less they questioned. And the less they questioned, the easier it became to hide the cost of maintaining order. Often, disappearance followed a pattern: a tense week of whispers, subtle shifts in alliances, the sudden coolness of someone's gaze. The mistress learned to recognize the warning signs, though she rarely intervened. Women who teetered on the edge of vanishing carried a particular look in their eyes, a quiet resignation that revealed they understood their fate long before it arrived. They moved through the palace as though walking on water, each step a fragile attempt to stay above what waited beneath. Their silence grew heavier, their smiles thinned, and then, one morning, they were simply gone. Servants, who noticed everything, sometimes exchanged glances when a woman disappeared. They had seen her sweeping the floor the day before or delivering a message at dusk. But they said nothing. The court had taught them that inquiries led to consequences, and consequences fell hardest on those who asked questions. So they continued their tasks, letting the absences accumulate like dust in corners no one bothered to sweep. A mistress observed this quiet acceptance and felt its chill settle against her spine. The palace's indifference was not directed only at servants. It waited patiently for anyone who became vulnerable. For the women who remained, these disappearances functioned as warnings carved into the architecture itself. Each missing figure became a reminder that survival was never guaranteed. Influence could evaporate. Favor could shift. A single mistake could redefine a woman's place, pushing her from visibility to oblivion faster than she could prepare for. The mistress learned to move with calculated restraint, adjusting her posture, her expressions, her words, her silence, aware that every decision either anchored her position or loosened it. The emotional toll of these vanishings seeped quietly through the court. The mistress sometimes caught herself remembering the sound of a voice that no longer echoed through the chambers, or the glimpse of a face that would not appear again. Yet reflection offered no relief. The court allowed no room for mourning those it erased. To grieve openly invited suspicion. To grieve privately risked distraction. The palace required its women to master a form of disciplined forgetting, one that allowed them to notice loss without acknowledging it. There was a strange intimacy in the proximity of disappearance. The mistress could pass through a doorway where a woman once stood, touch a railing that another had polished, or sit in a chamber where someone else had whispered her fears. These traces lingered, though they carried no power. The court erased identities but not impressions, allowing the physical world to remember what its people chose to forget. This paradox unsettled the mistress more than she admitted: how easily a life could vanish, yet how stubbornly its outline remained. In moments of quiet, She wondered whether anyone would notice if she disappeared as well. Would courtiers create polite explanations? Would servants exchange glances? Would the king look confused for a day, then turn to someone else for comfort? The possibility pressed against her like a cold hand. Her survival felt both urgent and precarious, shaped by forces she could influence only partially. Disappearance was not merely something that happened to others. It was a fate waiting for her should she falter. And so she moved carefully, crafting her presence with the same precision she used to craft her silence. She understood that the court devoured the unprotected first, but its appetite rarely ended there. Every woman lived under the threat of being folded into its quiet hunger. Everything described here reveals how disappearance functioned as the court's most efficient form of regulation, preserving order by erasing those who no longer fit its designs. From within this chilling logic, a sharper instinct begins to anchor itself inside the mistress. Approaching now is a moment when she must decide whether watching others fade is enough, or whether she will play a role in ensuring who disappears next. A mistress in the Tudor court eventually learned that survival depended less on what she gained and more on what she refused to carry. Loss surrounded her, women disappearing quietly, rivals falling suddenly from favor, servants dismissed without explanation. Yet she discovered that allowing these absences to touch her too deeply threatened her stability. The court did not reward empathy. It rewarded endurance, shaped by selective indifference. So she trained herself to look forward, even when the past tugged at her, with the faint persistence of a half-remembered whisper. Regret was a luxury she could not afford. Each disappearance, each downfall, each shifting of alliances carved away at her capacity to reflect. To dwell on what had happened to others risked slowing her pace in a world that demanded constant forward movement. The palace was a place where vulnerability, once exposed, spread quickly like a stain. If she allowed herself to grieve openly or even privately in ways that weakened her posture, others would sense it. And sensing weakness became the first step toward exploiting it. The court's instinct for opportunism sharpened around anyone who hesitated. Over time, the mistress learned to compartmentalize. She pushed memories of fallen women into the furthest corners of her mind, storing them like old garments that no longer fit but could not be thrown away. She recalled their smiles, their ambitions, their subtle missteps. Yet she taught herself not to linger on these recollections for long. Lingering invited emotional weight, and emotional weight slowed her movements, clouded her instincts, dulled the precision she needed to survive. The palace rewarded clarity, not attachment. Selective numbness became part of her daily routine. Each morning, she adjusted her dress, her posture, and her demeanor with the same cold discipline she applied to her emotions. If she heard that someone she once spoke with had been dismissed, she absorbed the information with a steady expression. If a woman who once laughed beside her was suddenly missing from the evening meal, she allowed the recognition to pass through her without catching hold. The court demanded that its women master this quiet erasure. A mistress who showed too much concern for another's misfortune risked suggesting guilt, or worse, aligning herself with the losing side. It was not that she lacked compassion entirely. There were moments, brief ones, when a memory resurfaced with unexpected force, a shared joke in a passageway, a frightened glance exchanged during a tense audience, a small kindness offered in a dark hour. But she learned to extinguish these recollections before they shaped her behavior. Sentiment invited danger. Nostalgia invited exposure. The past, no matter how familiar, no matter how human, had become a liability she could not allow herself to indulge. The court reinforced this habit relentlessly. Every corridor reminded her of someone who no longer walked through it. Every chamber held echoes of spaces that had once belonged to someone else. Even the king's shifting moods taught her to view relationships as temporary arrangements dependent on utility rather than affection. She realized early on that attachment carried a cost no one warned her about. It made the inevitable losses heavier. And heavy things sank quickly in the palace's relentless tide of ambition. She learned to adopt a gaze that passed over others without settling. This gaze kept her safe. It allowed her to observe without absorbing, to analyze without empathizing. When a woman faltered, the mistress noted the cause, the timing, the consequences, but not the tragedy. She treated these moments as lessons rather than emotional burdens. In doing so, she sharpened her instincts while protecting herself from the pull of shared humanity the court had long since discarded. Looking back became dangerous for another reason as well. The past exposed patterns she wished not to see too clearly. It showed how often she had benefited from someone else's misfortune. It revealed the compromises she had accepted, the small cruelties she had allowed to pass without protest, the silences that had protected her at others' expense. Reflecting on these details risked unraveling the narrative she relied on to justify her survival. So she looked forward, telling herself that dwelling on her choices would not change them. The court, with its constant motion, helped her maintain this avoidance. The pace of intrigue left little room for introspection. Each day brought new calculations, new risks, and new decisions that demanded her full attention. The mistress allowed herself to be consumed by this momentum, using it as both shield and excuse. The past faded, not because it lost significance, but because she learned to treat it as distant noise, something she could acknowledge without allowing it to shape her. Yet, even in her practiced detachment, a faint awareness persisted, the knowledge that her indifference protected her only temporarily. The court demanded this discipline from everyone, yet punished them all the same. Looking back risked exposing her own fragility, but refusing to look back meant she sometimes forgot how thin the line was between her and those who had vanished. This discomfort flickered beneath her composed exterior, though she kept it buried beneath layers of practiced stillness. And so she walked through the palace with the elegance of someone who had learned not to turn her head. Her posture, her voice, her measured expressions all reflected the discipline of someone who understood that acknowledging loss endangered her grip on the present. She survived by refusing to trace the shadows behind her. Everything described here reveals how emotional restraint became both shield and burden, shaping a mistress who learned to preserve herself by erasing the past. From within this disciplined silence, a colder resolve begins to harden in her, demanding choices that move beyond indifference. Ahead lies a moment when morality bends entirely around survival, leaving no room for hesitation. Morality inside the Tudor court did not resemble the ideals preached in churches or written in the king's proclamations. It shifted with circumstance, reshaped itself around fear, and hardened according to necessity. For a mistress navigating this environment, the boundaries between right and wrong blurred until they became nearly unrecognizable. Her actions were not judged by intention, but by outcome, and survival became the only consistent standard. In such a world, moral clarity dissolved under layers of secrecy, ambition, and the quiet terror of becoming irrelevant. She learned quickly that the court valued results more than virtue. A gesture that might appear cruel to an outsider became understandable, even expected, when viewed through the lens of preservation. Looking the other way during someone's downfall did not make her heartless. It made her practical. Taking advantage of an opportunity created by another woman's misfortune did not make her manipulative. It made her perceptive. In a setting where power changed hands unpredictably, moral hesitation placed her in danger. Decisions had to be made swiftly, cleanly, and without apology. The court itself encouraged this redefinition. It rewarded those who adapted and punished those who clung too tightly to conventional notions of goodness. Kindness could expose her. Loyalty could trap her. Mercy could doom her. She began to understand that survival required a different set of rules. ones that allowed her to act decisively without lingering on the emotional consequences. Each choice became part of a broader strategy, and she evaluated her actions through a single, sharpened question: would this keep her safe? In this context, self-preservation was reframed not as selfishness, but as necessity. She lived in a world where alliances shifted with each rumor, where a single misinterpretation could unravel her position, and where a passing comment from the king could determine her future. She could not afford to make decisions based on idealism. Even small interactions carried weight. A misplaced word, a sympathetic glance offered at the wrong moment, a momentary show of softness could lead others to question her strength. And questioning her strength was the first step toward undermining her. Slowly, she found herself excusing actions she might once have condemned. Allowing someone else to be blamed for a mistake protected her position. Remaining silent when she witnessed an injustice preserved her standing. Distancing herself from a woman falling out of favor prevented suspicion from touching her. She learned to justify these choices with calm logic. The court required sacrifice, and she refused to let that sacrifice be her own. The more often she employed this reasoning, the more natural it became. The palace amplified this transformation by surrounding her with constant reminders of fragility. She saw women who had once been admired cast aside without explanation. She saw courtiers pretend not to recognize those who had lost influence. She saw the king's favor lift someone to prominence and then abandon her just as quickly. In these patterns, she recognized an undeniable truth. Moral steadfastness offered no protection. Adaptability, even when cold, ensured she stayed visible. Though she adjusted to these shifting expectations, the transformation left subtle marks on her inner life. She noticed that her thoughts grew sharper, stripped of the softness she once carried. She evaluated people not by their personalities, but by the risks they posed. She sensed the motives behind gestures before acknowledging the gestures themselves. In her mind, every interaction became a calculation. She found it unsettling at times, but also strangely empowering. The court had forced her into a world where emotional survival required intellectual precision. Still, there were moments when fragments of old moral instincts surfaced. A sudden memory of a woman who had disappeared, a servant's trembling hands, a rival's pale expression when she received news that would end her future. These images flickered briefly like candle flames before being extinguished by the cold discipline she relied upon. She recognized that allowing such thoughts to take root would weaken her resolve. The court had no patience for women who hesitated, so she buried the memories and continued forward. Over time, she ceased to question the morality of her choices. She accepted them as natural extensions of her role, woven into the palace's structure long before she ever entered it. The court had shaped her into someone who could endure its demands, even when those demands reshaped her conscience. She understood now that survival was not simply a goal. It had become the measure by which her decisions were judged and justified. She walked through the palace with the composure of someone who had relinquished the version of morality she once knew. In its place stood a new framework molded by danger, opportunity, and the need to remain visible. Her conscience had not vanished. It had adapted. It had learned to speak quietly, in tones that did not interfere with her judgment. She accepted this evolution not with pride, but with the clear-eyed recognition that the court allowed no other path. What remained of her former self lingered only in fleeting moments. Unwelcome, unhelpful, easily dismissed. The woman she had become did not look backward. She could not. Survival demanded her full attention, and morality bent itself around that requirement with silent obedience. Everything described here reveals how necessity reshaped her conscience until survival became the only standard by which choices were measured. From within this refined logic, a deeper ruthlessness begins to settle into her decisions. In the distance waits a moment when the boundaries she once tried to preserve will disappear entirely in the name of staying alive. History remembers the Tudor court as a place of glittering ceremony and ruthless ambition. leaving behind images of women who rose and fell with alarming speed. A mistress standing inside that world understood how incomplete those impressions were. Chroniclers wrote confidently about motives they never witnessed, condemning actions whose origins they never bothered to uncover. Their judgments travelled through time without acknowledging the pressure that shaped each decision. What survived in the record was a simplified cruelty, stripped of the daily fears that gave it form. Every morning, a mistress woke not to luxury, but to uncertainty that pressed against her ribs as soon as she opened her eyes. She moved through chambers where even polished stones seemed to listen, aware that a single misstep could alter her future. Nothing about her position felt stable. She depended not on rank or lineage, but on shifting emotion. Something too fragile to secure anything except temporary comfort. Chroniclers never described this sensation. They captured the outcomes, but ignored the silent terror that preceded them. Observers outside the court often assumed these women acted out of selfishness or vanity. They overlooked the constant surveillance that shaped their behavior. Servants watching for advantage, courtiers whispering over alliances, rivals searching for signs of weakness. A mistress learned quickly that some choices, though harsh, protected her from dangers others never saw. When she withheld kindness, it was not because she lacked empathy. It was because the court punished softness with alarming efficiency. No chronicler paused long enough to examine the cost of being gentle. The palace required a form of discipline that dissolved hesitation. When a rumour threatened her standing, she reacted not out of cruelty, but necessity. When she avoided defending another woman, it was not indifference. It was an understanding that compassion could expose her. The court left no room for moral debate. It demanded quiet, immediate responses to threats that arrived without warning. Yet history recorded only the responses, not the weight of danger pressing her into them. What troubled her most was how effortlessly the world outside judged women like her. Writers who had never stepped inside the palace condemned them for choices made under pressure strong enough to deform anyone's conscience. These writers ignored the machinery of power that surrounded each mistress, a structure designed to consume whoever stumbled. It was easier to label them heartless than to examine the forces that cornered them. The court turned survival into a puzzle with no clean solution. Every option demanded a sacrifice, often of someone else. Even as she maneuvered through this unforgiving world, she knew how she would be remembered. History favored clarity, not nuance. She would not be portrayed as someone defending herself. She would become a simplified figure whose ambition overshadowed her fear. The silence around her daily struggles would allow future generations to imagine that she acted freely, even confidently. They would not see the tension in her breath, the calculation in her silence, the exhaustion that came from navigating danger without pause. No one recorded the moments she froze in a corridor, sensing a shift she could not name. No one wrote about the nights she lay awake, replaying conversations to ensure she had revealed nothing. No one described how heavy it felt to walk past the space where another woman once stood, knowing the court had quietly erased her. These details remained unspoken, lost beneath the loud judgment of those who never lived her life. She understood that the legacy did not belong to women like her. Legacy belonged to those who wrote, not those who endured. So she accepted that her story would be flattened, her motives mistranslated, her fears ignored. The record would show only that she survived, never the cost of that survival. It would show the sharpness of her choices, but never the pressure that forced them. It would show the Queen's dignity, the King's authority, the court's brilliance, but not the daily erosion suffered by the women who stood too close to power. And yet, in the quiet moments when she lifted her chin and composed her face for another day, she felt a steady truth. The court judged her long before history ever would. Survival required decisions that no observer had the right to simplify. She moved through the palace, knowing that every breath she took represented a choice the world would later misunderstand. Everything described here reveals how judgment outlived the fears that shaped her. leaving only a cold narrative stripped of its human cost. From within this distortion, her resolve hardens further as she learns to protect herself without expecting understanding. Ahead waits a moment when another woman's fall offers her a dangerous opening she can no longer ignore. The fall of another mistress rarely arrived with warning. It drifted quietly at first. A slight change in the king's tone. A subtle shift in how courtiers positioned themselves. A lingering absence at meals. These early signs spread through the palace with the softness of dust, noticeable only to those who understood what to look for. A mistress who recognized them felt a mixture of dread and caution, because someone else's decline often signaled the beginning of new instability for everyone. Yet she also understood that stepping forward to help could drag her down with the one who was already sinking. Public rescue was out of the question. The court saw any display of loyalty as evidence of alliance. And alliances became liabilities the moment one participant lost favor. A mistress learned this lesson early. When another woman faltered, whether through miscalculation, drumor, or simple misfortune, intervening could only attach her to the same trajectory. The palace punished sympathy with startling efficiency. To appear aligned with someone falling from grace was to risk being pulled into the same descent. So she maintained her composure, keeping her distance even as she observed the unraveling with a steady, unreadable expression. Silence became both shield and strategy. The less she said, the safer she remained. Courtiers whispered questions, testing her reactions, searching for signs of alliance or guilt. She offered them only calm indifference. She avoided rooms where discussions about the fallen woman grew too loud, and she avoided conversations where someone sought her opinion. The court interpreted neutrality as wisdom, but she knew neutrality was simply survival in disguise. Speaking too freely risked drawing suspicion. Speaking too sympathetically risked being associated with weakness. Silence served her better than any verbal defense. Even as she refrained from offering public support, she felt the pull of private acknowledgement. There were moments when she encountered the fallen mistress in a corridor, her posture stiffening under the weight of fear, her eyes carrying a quiet plea for reassurance. These moments stirred something human inside her, yet she forced herself to remain still. A gentle word, a sympathetic glance, even a slight pause in her step could signal alliance to watching servants or courtiers. The palace turned every gesture into a message. She guarded her movements carefully, knowing that even kindness could be weaponized against her. Privately, she sometimes calculated what the other woman's fall meant for her own position. The court created opportunities out of loss, chambers that became available, influence that shifted, and attention that could be redirected. She understood that benefiting from another's misfortune did not require direct involvement. The court rearranged itself naturally, and all she had to do was step into the space that appeared. This form of advantage felt sharp and uncomfortable at first, but the palace taught her not to question it. When survival depended on proximity to power, refusing an opening became as dangerous as seeking one too aggressively. The fallen mistress usually sensed her isolation before anyone acknowledged it. She walked with a certain stiffness, as though the floor beneath her had turned unstable. People greeted her with excessive politeness or avoided her altogether. Servants hesitated before entering her chambers. Even the king's familiar gestures cooled. The palace delivered its verdict through avoidance, not confrontation. A mistress watching this understood she had witnessed variations of this fate many times before. She could predict the sequence: isolation, uncertainty, dismissal, disappearance. And yet, the watching mistress felt a faint tremor of fear, knowing that the same pattern could take shape around her at any time. The fall of another woman became a mirror reflecting her own vulnerability. She recognized in the others unraveling the fragile scaffolding that held her position together. The court never allowed its women to forget how thin the line was between influence and irrelevance. Observing another's descent reinforced her determination to protect herself at all costs. even when that protection required stepping back from someone else's suffering. Occasionally, she benefited directly from the fallen woman's absence. A quiet word from the king, a shift in housing arrangements, an invitation to a private conversation. These small gains accumulated, shaping her future quietly. She felt no pride in them, but neither did she feel guilt. The court rewarded those who remained standing, not those who mourned the fallen. Her survival depended on maintaining this mindset, to move forward without the burden of remorse, to accept the palace's cruelty as part of its design, to recognize that she was both participant and witness in a system that consumed its weakest. In time, she learned to detach from these moments emotionally, though not intellectually. She studied each downfall as a lesson, analyzing its causes, its timing, its subtle warnings. These observations sharpened her understanding of the court more effectively than any mentor could. Every fall revealed a flaw she must avoid, a risk she must anticipate, a gesture she must learn not to make. The palace taught through loss, and she became fluent in its curriculum. She knew, too, that her role as silent observer would one day tempt others to do the same when her own influence waned. The court offered no loyalty except to power, and power never stayed in one place for long. Yet she continued to move with measured elegance, concealing the fear beneath each breath. Watching another woman fall reminded her not of cruelty, but of inevitability. Everything described here reveals how witnessing another woman's downfall became both a warning and an opportunity, shaping a mistress who learned to remain untouched by the suffering she dared not acknowledge. From within this tension, a sharper instinct begins to guide her movements as she navigates the palace's growing volatility. What waits just beyond this moment is a shift that forces her to rely on silence more heavily than ever before. Silence inside the Tudor court was never accidental. It was a discipline, a weapon, and a shield, refined through years of watching how words destabilized those who trusted them too freely. A mistress learned early that sound could betray her, but silence rarely did. The palace interpreted every gesture, every pause, every breath. Speaking only expanded the number of ways she could be misread. And so she trained herself to retreat into quiet, letting others reveal themselves while she preserved the safety that only stillness could provide. The suffering of others presented the greatest test of this discipline. She witnessed tears hidden behind tapestries, trembling hands clutching letters that carried bad news, pale faces returning from audiences where favor had evaporated. The instinct to comfort flickered in her, brief and human, but she extinguished it with deliberate calm. Consolation created connection, and connection created vulnerability. The court punished both. She learned to pass by these women with steady steps, her expression composed, her gaze forward. Their pain did not belong to her. She could not afford to let it. Silence protected her position more effectively than alliances ever could. Words, once spoken, could be twisted into accusations, but silence offered nothing to grasp. When rumors spread, her quietness made her seem wiser than she felt. When courtiers tested her with probing questions, her controlled responses left them uncertain, unwilling to risk misinterpreting her. When rivals looked for weakness, they found only a calm surface. Silence became a kind of invisibility, allowing her to remain present without exposing the thoughts she guarded so carefully. Even the king interpreted her silence in ways that benefited her. In moments when he sought comfort, she listened without interrupting, letting him fill the space with his concerns. This restraint made her appear patient, thoughtful, and trustworthy, though she offered little beyond quiet presence. In meetings where others rushed to impress him with advice, she spoke only when necessary, allowing the king to believe her words carried greater weight because they were few. Her silence shaped his perception more effectively than any argument could. But silence served another purpose. it preserved her survival. The court rewarded those who adapted to its unspoken rules. And the most important rule was that nothing should be admitted aloud. To acknowledge fear invited manipulation. To acknowledge ambition invited scrutiny. To acknowledge sorrow invited exploitation. By keeping her interior life sealed, she protected herself from the court's appetite for weakness. Those who revealed too much found their vulnerabilities echoed in whispers, magnified until they became fatal. Silence also allowed her to observe. She noticed the subtle changes in posture, the faint shifts in expression, the tremors in someone's voice that revealed more than words ever could. Through quiet attention, she understood who felt threatened, who felt emboldened, who hid desperation behind carefully practiced smiles. This knowledge shaped her movements, guiding her towards safe alliances and away from dangers others hadn't yet recognized. Information traveled loudly through the palace, but its most valuable forms traveled quietly, hidden beneath gestures and glances only she bothered to study. Still, silence demanded sacrifice. There were moments when her restraint felt like a weight pressing against her lungs. Watching someone fall without offering help left a faint ache behind her ribs. An ache she buried each time it surfaced, remaining quiet while others suffered, chipped away at the parts of her that once felt soft. But softness had no place here. The court demanded a version of her that did not flinch. She became that version because survival required it, even when it hollowed something inside her. Yet she found a peculiar strength in this transformation. Silence made her unassailable. It prevented others from predicting her, manipulating her, or using her words against her. It granted her control in a world determined to strip it away. Each time she held her tongue, she felt the quiet settle deeper into her, shaping not only her actions, but her identity. She no longer viewed silence as absence. It had become its own form of presence, one that carried power precisely because it left so much unsaid. Stillness became the language she trusted most, where others revealed themselves through frantic attempts to be heard. She allowed her silence to speak for her. The palace, so noisy with ambition, found her quietness unnerving, and unnerving others became its own defense. Through this stillness, she carved out a space where she could breathe, think, and remain untouched by forces that consumed so many around her. She understood eventually that silence did not merely protect her. It defined her. It allowed her to remain standing in a world that measured strength not by volume but by endurance. Everything described here reveals how silence evolved into her most reliable safeguard, granting her power by refusing to expose what others sought to uncover. From within this deepening quiet, her strategies sharpen further as she prepares to face the isolation that success inevitably brings. Waiting just beyond this stillness is a shift where solitude becomes both shelter and price. Success inside the Tudor court never arrived as a warm embrace. It settled instead like a thin frost along the edges of a mistress's life. Beautiful from a distance, yet cold upon touch. Those who believed influence brought companionship misunderstood the nature of power in the palace. The higher a mistress climbed, the fewer footsteps she heard beside her. Proximity to the king offered visibility. But visibility created distance, pushing others away with the quiet force of suspicion and envy. True closeness became nearly impossible. Every woman who approached her carried motives she needed to examine carefully. Was the gesture sincere or strategic? Was the tone friendly or probing? Even harmless conversations acquired layers of meaning inside the court's charged atmosphere. A mistress learned to measure her responses, adjusting each word so it revealed nothing of her inner life. She cultivated politeness without warmth, familiarity without trust. These boundaries protected her, yet they also deepened the solitude that wrapped itself around her like a second skin. Fear became something she carried alone. She could not confess her uncertainty to courtiers who might use it against her. She could not share her anxieties with servants who repeated everything they heard. She could not express her vulnerability to the king, whose affection depended partly on the illusion of her composure. Even in the privacy of her chambers, she felt watched, not always by people, but by the expectations that her position demanded. The silence in those rooms was heavy, thick with the knowledge that the fears she swallowed had nowhere to go. The court offered her admiration, but withheld companionship. Women who once spoke with her freely now did so with caution, aware that proximity to her could either elevate or endanger them. Some avoided her entirely, unable to mask the bitterness of knowing that her presence dimmed their own prospects. Even small gestures, sharing a glance, exchanging a brief remark, felt loaded with potential consequences. She moved through corridors surrounded by people, yet none of them walked with her. The palace trained her to appear complete on her own, even when isolation pressed firmly against her spine. Power, once obtained, demanded its own rituals of distance. She learned to keep her posture composed, her voice measured, her face unreadable. The court praised her for this elegance, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, that it carved away the parts of her capable of trusting someone without calculation. Every room required a performance of control. Every conversation required restraint. She became a figure others admired but could not approach. Someone who inspired respect yet rarely received genuine affection. There were moments when she missed the simplicity of being overlooked. Before influence wrapped itself around her, she had experienced brief flashes of companionship, shared laughter with another woman during a quiet task, whispered concerns exchanged in back corridors, fleeting alliances, unburdened by ambition. Those moments faded once she became someone others feared to disappoint or offend. Power replaced the connection, and she accepted the exchange because the court allowed no alternative. At times, she attempted to imagine what true closeness might feel like within the palace walls. She pictured sitting with someone who understood the pressure beneath her calm exterior, someone who recognized the constant vigilance her position required. Yet the thought dissolved quickly. Trusting another person felt reckless in a place where alliances shifted faster than candle flames. Solitude, though sharp, was predictable. Dependence invited danger. Even the king, whose affection had elevated her, could not ease the isolation woven into her life. He confided in her when it suited him and grew distant when his attention drifted elsewhere. His presence warmed her chambers, but his absence chilled them more deeply than the stone walls ever could. She learned not to expect consistency from him, or from anyone. Her isolation was not a temporary condition. It had become a structural part of her existence. The silent cost of remaining visible. Yet she carried this solitude with an elegance that did not betray its weight. She walked through the palace with steady steps, aware that loneliness had become both her armor and her burden. She understood that maintaining her position required accepting a kind of emotional exile, a separation from the intimacy that connected others outside the court. Power, once secured, surrounded her with a space no one else dared enter. Everything described here reveals how success confined her within a quiet perimeter, granting her influence at the price of every human comfort she once allowed herself to imagine. From within this widening solitude, her resolve hardens further as she learns to navigate danger without the support others take for granted. Approaching now is a moment when staying alone becomes more perilous than speaking, forcing her to confront what isolation cannot protect. Survival inside the Tudor court arrived with a subtle bitterness that clung to every triumph. A mistress who managed to remain standing after years of hidden conflict discovered that endurance offered no feeling of victory. It simply allowed her to keep breathing in a place where breath itself felt borrowed. The court required her vigilance constantly, demanding awareness so sharp it bordered on exhaustion. Even moments that appeared peaceful carried an undercurrent of threat, as though the walls themselves waited for her to falter. The relief she once imagined survival might bring never materialized. Instead, she felt an ache at the base of her ribs, the lingering reminder that danger had not disappeared, it had merely changed shape. She adjusted her routines with quiet precision, observing those around her for signs of shifting alliances or rising tensions. The king's glances, the whispers that drifted through corridors, the faint changes in how someone addressed her. All of these became signals she needed to interpret with care. She did not allow herself to relax. Relaxation invited risk. And risk had already consumed too many women before her. Even small pleasures felt diluted by caution. A warm fire, a private meal, a rare moment of quiet. Each was overshadowed by the knowledge that none of it promised stability. She understood that the court valued women like her only when they served a purpose. And purposes changed with alarming speed. Survival did not elevate her. It suspended her in a fragile position where slipping even slightly would undo everything she had endured. This suspended state left her alert at all times. Her breath slow, her gaze calculated, her thoughts constantly evaluating what could go wrong. The absence of true safety reshaped her inner life more deeply than she expected. She no longer anticipated kindness from others or trusted the fleeting warmth of favor. She recognized how quickly affection dissolved under political pressure, how easily a smile could mask someone's calculation. Even when the king offered gestures of affection, she sensed the limits of those moments. His consistency belonged to no one. His approval did not guarantee protection. She had witnessed too many examples of favor turning cold without explanation to believe her survival rested in his hands alone. Her isolation deepened the longer she stayed alive in this world. The women who might have understood her most had either disappeared or maintained a careful distance. Those who remained viewed her with a mixture of envy and suspicion. Aware that she had outlasted rivals they once considered unshakable, yet outlasting others brought no comfort. The palace allowed her to continue living within its walls, but at the cost of any sense of belonging. She existed between fear and endurance, neither victorious nor defeated, simply suspended in a state that demanded constant effort. She began to understand that the emotional toll of survival exceeded the physical dangers she faced. Each day required her to shed attachments, expectations, and the faint hope that she might eventually feel secure. She moved through the palace as though walking across thin ice, controlled, measured, unwilling to place weight anywhere she had not tested first. This vigilance became so ingrained that she could no longer distinguish between instinct and fear. They had fused into a single method of existence. The price for staying alive crystallized slowly. She had lost ease, lost trust, lost the warmth of companionship, and lost the ability to rest without tension. Even her silence, once a chosen strategy, became a cage she could not escape. She worried that speaking too freely would undo her. Yet speaking too little revealed how much of herself she had surrendered to the demands of survival. The palace shaped her into someone both strong and hollow, capable of enduring, yet denied the comfort of believing that endurance meant she had won anything. She occasionally wondered what victory would even look like in a place such as this. Accumulating influence meant accumulating enemies. Gaining visibility meant losing privacy. Remaining close to the king meant being watched by those who resented her presence. Each achievement carried the weight of new expectations, and each step forward demanded sacrifices she could no longer count. Victory, she realized, had never been the point. The court offered no version of triumph that did not require some part of her to be stripped away. Even the thought of leaving the court held no comfort. Departure, voluntary or otherwise, meant stepping into a life defined by what she had lost rather than what she had gained. The court's shadows would follow her, carried in memory rather than consequence. Survival here did not end when she walked away. It lived inside her, shaping every future moment she might inhabit. Yet, she continued to endure, because the alternative was to vanish like so many women before her, remaining alive, even inside this suspended existence. I felt like the only proof that she still had some measure of control. She learned to accept the emptiness woven into her survival, understanding that the palace rewarded endurance only with more endurance. Everything described here reveals how survival stripped away satisfaction, leaving her with vigilance instead of victory and tension instead of triumph. From within this hollow endurance, her understanding of power shifts again, preparing her for the reckoning that shadows even those who seem most secure. What edges closer now is the moment when all she has gained demands its final, quiet payment. Reaching the height of power inside the Tudor court did not bring the stillness a mistress once imagined. What awaited her instead was a deeper, more consuming alertness, an understanding that her position, though elevated, remained as fragile as ever. The palace did not reward her ascent with peace. It only changed the nature of her fears. She no longer worried about climbing, she worried about falling. And the higher she had risen, the further she knew she could drop. People treated her differently now. Servants lowered their voices when she passed. Courtiers watched her movements with careful calculation, and rivals hardened their smiles into brittle politeness. Yet beneath the surface, she sensed the same danger that had always stalked women like her. Power had not erased the possibility of replacement. It had simply drawn new eyes to her presence. The king's attention, though steady for the moment, remained unpredictable. A single shift in his mood could rewrite her future completely. The shadows of the women who had fallen before her stayed with her, lingering at the edges of her thoughts. She did not speak their names, nor did anyone else. But silence did nothing to erase their memory. Their disappearances formed the contour of her ascent. Every loss a step she had taken without ever meaning to. They had been rivals, companions, obstacles, warnings. She remembered their faces, even when the court pretended they had never existed. Their absence shaped her as much as her own endurance. Sometimes, alone at night, she felt the weight of those memories pressing against her ribcage. She wondered how many of them had sensed danger too late. She wondered if they had also believed, at some point, that reaching the king's favour would protect them. Now she understood how misguided that hope had been. Power in the Tudor court never sheltered anyone, it only illuminated them, making them easier to target when the tides shifted. The lives that had been erased did not vanish into nothing. They folded into her awareness, becoming part of the quiet fear she carried with her every day. Her own fear transformed with her new status. Instead of fearing obscurity, she now feared visibility. Instead of fearing abandonment, she feared the illusion of stability. She monitored every word spoken near her, analyzing whether a comment hinted at brewing resentment or shifting alliances. Her gestures became deliberate, her expressions measured, her thoughts guarded. She had learned long ago that misinterpreting a single glance could end a life. Now she lived by that knowledge even more rigorously. She also found herself haunted by a strange guilt that she never voiced aloud. The court had taught her to survive, and survival meant outlasting others. But in quiet moments, she felt the echo of those who had been pushed aside. Sometimes by her choices, sometimes by her silence, sometimes simply by existing in a world where only one woman could stand closest to the king. Their memory followed her like a cold draught slipping through a closed door. She had no words to honor them. Speaking of them would expose her. Mourning them would weaken her. Forgetting them was impossible. The palace around her remained alive with whispers, shifting alliances, and subtle venom delivered with courtly grace. Her triumph did not change that. It only changed how directly those forces touched her. She sensed admiration from some, resentment from others, and curiosity from those who wondered how long she could hold her place. Power made her both respected and isolated. The court bowed to her, but none of its people truly stood beside her. At times, she looked at her reflection and struggled to reconcile the woman she had become with the woman she once was. Power had demanded that she abandon softness, trust, and the luxury of hesitation. Now it demanded that she maintain an unbreakable composure, even when memories pressed against her chest like a locked room filled with ghosts. She understood that the women she had outlasted were part of her story, even if the court refused to record their existence. Their absence had shaped her rise, and their silence had made room for her survival. Yet she also knew this truth. The court never allowed a woman to remain at the top without exacting a price. The past did not stay buried, and the future did not promise mercy. Holding power meant holding a burning coal, useful for warmth, but destructive if gripped too tightly. Everything described here reveals how reaching the summit offered her neither comfort nor certainty, only a clearer view of the dangers surrounding her. From within this uneasy height, the memories of those erased press more urgently against her survival. Soon is the moment when those memories become the true measure of what her ascent has cost. Power inside the Tudor court often appeared clean on the surface, polished by ceremony and guarded by ritual. Yet its foundations were built upon choices that left no gentle traces. A mistress who managed to keep her position for years carried with her not only triumph, but the weight of decisions that had carved a path through other women's lives. She learned early that a place beside the king was not something granted once and kept through virtue. It had to be defended, protected, and insulated through acts that would never appear in any chronicle. Whenever she walked through the palace corridors, she sensed the silence of those who had vanished to make room for her. Her survival had always depended on judgment made in moments of urgency, moments when she chose not to intervene, when she allowed suspicion to grow around others, or when she stepped aside just enough for another woman's downfall to unfold naturally. These decisions rarely felt dramatic. Most were quiet, subtle, and nearly invisible outside the narrow world of court life. Yet each one altered the fate of someone standing too close to the line between favour and ruin. The court did not reward kindness, it rewarded endurance. And endurance often came at the cost of someone else's voice, fading into nothingness. When she looked back, she could trace no single moment when she had consciously chosen cruelty. Rather, the court shaped her into someone who understood that survival demanded the disappearance of others. A whisper left unchallenged, a warning left unsent, a smile withheld at a critical moment. These small gestures compounded into a legacy she carried alone. To the outside world, her rise appeared almost graceful. People admired her composure, her strategic silence, and her ability to maintain the king's interest. But beneath that calm exterior lay a sequence of decisions that had redirected the lives of many who had once stood near her. The court had always disguised its brutality beneath velvet and gold. It presented itself as orderly, dignified, and moral, while operating through a series of invisible sacrifices. She understood this better than most. Every woman who reached the upper tiers of influence did so by stepping into a place where someone else had stood only weeks or months before. It was impossible to survive without leaving shadows behind. And although she rarely allowed herself to dwell on those shadows, their presence never fully disappeared. Some nights, she felt the weight of those lost lives more clearly. She could not name them aloud. Names had been wiped from conversation, from rumour, from memory. But she remembered their faces. She remembered the flicker of uncertainty in their eyes when misfortune first touched them. She remembered the moments when she realized that her silence, or her distance, had sealed their fate. She had not wished them harm, yet harm had come, and she had watched it without stepping forward. The court praised her for navigating these moments with grace. Only she knew how deeply they marked her. Yet the strangest part of her legacy was that none of it belonged to her. History would not record the women who disappeared, nor the choices that precipitated their erasure. It would not recall the tension of those nights spent weighing danger against conscience. It would not mention the subtle betrayals that had shaped her survival. Instead, the chronicles would remember only the woman who remained at the king's side. her story reduced to a name, a title, and a role. Her endurance would be depicted as victory, her silence as virtue, and her strategic caution as natural talent. The price she paid, the lives that had intersected with hers only to fall away, would dissolve completely. This was the true cruelty of the Tudor court, not simply the choices required for survival, but the way those choices left no official trace. History kept only the winners, and even then, it kept them in softened form. She knew that posterity would never understand the invisible ledger she carried within her. The tally of withheld warnings, abandoned alliances, and calculated retreat. She also knew that no one would ask. People preferred stories of triumph to stories of cost. Everything described here shows how the place she secured was built over the quiet erasure of countless others. From within that silence, the weight of what remains begins to press against her victories, somewhere beyond the margin of memory. A final reckoning waits for the woman who stood alone at the end. They said the women who survived the Tudor court were ruthless. And perhaps that is how the story looks when written centuries later, with ink that has forgotten the temperature of fear. But anyone who watched them closely, anyone who stood silently in doorways or lingered near the shadowed arches, understood something far more unsettling. Their choices were not born from cruelty. They were born from the simple, brutal fact that no one allowed them to be gentle. Strength was demanded of them long before anyone explained the cost. A mistress who hesitated was a mistress who vanished. A mistress who pitied was a mistress replaced. Every smile she offered, every silence she held, every step she took near the king or far from him had consequences that reached into corners she could not see. The court taught her repeatedly that survival was not a virtue. It was a punishment awarded only to those who learned quickly and forgot slower. So when the world insisted that she sacrifice others to keep herself alive, it was technically true. But the truth was shaped by circumstances that no official chronicle ever admitted. She lived in a system built to unmake women. She learned to guard her breath, her posture, her words, and her secrets. She learned that being soft was more dangerous than being wrong. And she learned that mercy, no matter how beautifully imagined, left no survivors. There were nights when she sat alone in a chamber lit by a single candle, watching its flame bend and straighten with every draught, as though even the air itself was unsettled. Her reflection in the window looked faint, almost translucent, like someone who had only half permission to exist. In those moments, she wondered whether life would have been easier if she had been born as someone less visible, someone whose footsteps did not echo so loudly across the tiled floors of the court. But even that thought was a luxury she rarely allowed herself. She knew what was expected of her. She knew what happened to women who stepped out of their roles or questioned the rules. There were names she remembered, names whispered once and never repeated. Women who smiled one week and were gone the next. Women who believed character mattered. Women who believed loyalty protected them. Women who never understood how deeply survival demanded the shedding of illusions. The quiet tragedies of those women formed the background of her life, like faint brushstrokes behind a painting's brighter colours. Their losses taught her the boundaries of safety. Their disappearances mapped the limits of trust. Their failures shaped her instincts until she could sense danger in a shift of breath or a flicker in the king's expression. She did not celebrate their downfalls. She learned from them. And that learning, cold as it appeared from the outside, was the only reason she remained. She gained little joy from her victories. They tasted like iron, not triumph. Holding her place meant pretending she felt nothing when another woman fell. It meant nodding politely as rumours circulated, even when she knew exactly where those rumours began. It meant watching a rival's smile stiffen into dread and knowing she could not intervene. Not because she was heartless, but because intervention was simply another form of self-harm. In private, she mourned the parts of herself she no longer recognized. She remembered a version of herself, long before the court, long before the king, who believed she might shape her life through gentleness. She remembered the girl who laughed more easily, who trusted more willingly, who did not shrink from the truth of her own emotions. That girl did not survive the palace walls. The woman sitting in her place understood that feelings were dangerous luxuries, best stored away like forbidden letters. If people centuries later judged her, it was because they had the privilege of distance. They could read stories in the safety of their armchairs, imagining morality was simple and choices were sharp-edged. They could pretend they would have done better, as though bravery were abundant and consequences gentle. But she knew better. The reality of court life was not sharp, it was suffocating. As cloth pressed over the mouth, every breath required calculation. Every word demanded restraint. Every kindness risked exposure. She did not sacrifice others because she wanted to. She sacrificed them because the palace required it. After all, the king's favour demanded it. Because the architecture of power left no space for shared survival. She did what the system taught her to do. And if history remembered her as ruthless, then history had never tried standing where she stood. Even so, she was not without regrets. At night, when she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of women who had crossed her path, some briefly, some with fragile hope, some with quiet despair. She did not hate them. She barely knew them. But she carried their shadows like unmarked stones in the hem of her gown. Heavy, persistent, impossible to discard. These were not sins by choice. They were debts she never asked to inherit. With time, she learned that victory within the Tudor world did not resemble triumph. It resembled survival layered over exhaustion. It resembled a woman sitting alone, holding a position that brought her no security and little comfort. It resembled a silence so deep it felt like another presence in the room. Power did not free her. It isolated her. And isolation, she discovered, could be a quieter form of punishment than exile. The world outside looked at her life and saw privilege. They never saw what it cost. They never saw the fears she swallowed, the thoughts she buried, the pieces of herself she destroyed to remain. They never understood that living through a system built on hierarchy meant accepting loss as a constant companion. She was not evil. She was trapped. And in that trap, she made choices that kept her alive, even if those choices erased the paths of women who walked beside her. Her story was not a tale of cruelty. It was a tale of a woman trying to breathe in a world that demanded her silence, her vigilance, and her transformation. If a single truth remained at the end of her life, it was this: she learned too late that survival and peace were not the same. One she obtained, the other she never touched. And so, as her story fades into the dim corridors of memory, all that lingers is a whisper, a reminder that even those called heartless were once simply trying not to disappear. Thank you for listening tonight. Rest well. Let the weight of their world fall away from your thoughts, and may sleep come gently to you.